So the proposition is, this House believes that investors and companies, not governments, are the best hope for social progress in America today. And there is no fence sitting. Please, everyone, put your hand up just once. So who agrees that this House believes that investors and companies, not governments, are the best hope for social progress in America today? I'm going to put my hand up both times because I'm just showing you how to put your hand up. Okay. No, just keep your hands up and let me get an estimate for the room. God, that's really close to 50-50. All right, who wants to go for against? I think that was ever so slightly less, so I'm going to say it was sort of 55 for and 45 against, okay? So that's what they've got to move the needle from.
How many of you know where the United States is on the Social Progress Index?
Put your hand up if yes.
God, 18. No. Out of 132 countries, it's 18. So arguably, the US could do better. What's number one? Denmark. Does the US want to be Denmark? Probably not. But we might be able to get up to where Australia is at number 9, Canada's at number 6. The question is how? I think that one of the things that I take from this whole debate is, do we think that the government has been good at social progress in recent years? Do we think it's the right thing for now, or has it maybe been part of the issue of causing trauma in what's been happening in this country? Our argument would be that actually today the best source of social progress is undoubtedly going to be private enterprise. And we've heard a lot about that today. And if you think about why, part of that is going to be the self-preservation of the private sector. So we've heard about performance, and we've heard about sometimes the studies look great, whether it be the corporates, whether it be the investors. The fact is, from a self-preservation perspective, business realizes it has to move away from a Friedmanian way of looking at its own business interests. It now has to be a part of society. And I think that what we've really seen today is that the encouragement of all the experimentation, all the challenges that we're going through and hearing about, is that private enterprise understands it has to move in that direction. Government, the role of government is really to create the stability. Let private enterprise move, but give some predictability in that regulatory construct and take care of the basic needs of its citizens, which arguably right now we're seeing as a very difficult thing in this country. So if we think about what's going to happen, how private enterprise will be the lead actor in encouraging and promoting this social progress, I'm going to summarize some of what I've heard today because I think I want to frame it in a way that I think shows the distinction from what I think government is capable of doing today, right now. One, the first piece is the idea of redefining what is it to be an activist or activism. Typically, when we think about activism, we think about social protest movements, nonprofit groups. We also think in the investment world of short-term activist investors. But I would say that what we've been hearing about today, and we've heard the Larry Fink letter ad nauseum, but that is all about the idea of long-term activism becoming activist. And part of that self-preservation of investment, passive, active, is to actually recalibrate what is their role in society. Their role in society is to actually be more active and take away what traditionally was an absentee landowner situation, and many times with investments really turned to proxy agencies and these sort of thing, is that now there's an understanding that the role of investment is to also be a role that is very, very healthy in society and working for society's social progress. The second thing that I think we all know this, that is done very well in the private sector, and for social progress, I really take umbrage in today in some of the comments I heard, is going to be the innovation side. And I think that it's hard to argue how fast government can work towards innovation. Government has other roles that it can do very successfully. But when it comes to the innovation that we think can happen in impact, whether it be corporate innovation, whether it be new forms of business, whether it be B Corps, there's tons of different innovative models that are happening right now. And I think we're at a bit of a nexus point to actually take what were often headwinds into tailwinds. And you can see it in green bonds, in the largest asset class in the world, which is in fixed income. Still small, I know that. But look at what's happening now to actually bring an impact tool to the way that we look at money and bring meaning into money. And the last one would be inclusion. And I think that one of the things that is going to be a real change is the idea that inclusion is, again, self-preservation as much as it's performance. We see the group data on group bias if you don't have distinction in your companies, and the same thing with the investors. And what I'd say is that inclusion is going to be, whether it be minorities, whether it be women, the one thing I would finish with is the more that we have minorities and women involved, the better we see impact comes because they have an intuitive understanding from what they've had to go through that a lot of men do not.
Excellent. So now, who's going to go first?
I am.
Right. 4 minutes on the clock.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm Lisa Wall. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's a pleasure to debate Matt Christensen in front of all you. We have been debating each other since we met 10 years ago, so it's fun to do it in front of several hundred people. So I want to say that if you look at the description of this debate, one of the things it says is that big companies and investors are emerging as the most outspoken advocates of actions to promote social progress. I just don't think that's been right. If you look at what has happened in the US in the last several years, what you've seen is the Women's March and other large-scale marches going on virtually every weekend. And what you've seen are more women running for office than at any point in our history, which is directly related to government. They aren't saying we want to go be heads of companies right now. Of course, we'd like to see more women as head of companies, but that's for another debate, right? They're saying, I need to go in and change the muscle of government because government is what controls the opportunities for the people. And if any of you have ever read John Rawls and the Theory of Justice, which was one of my favorite books in graduate school, he asked this: if no one could know what place he or she would occupy in the society being formed, what arrangement of the society would a rational person choose? He maintains that the choice for social structure would best benefit the unknowing chooser if she or he happened to end up in the least desirable position. It's a veil of ignorance. I think most people would say if they needed decisions made for them so that the least able among us would have an equal opportunity, they probably wouldn't leave that to a publicly traded company or a private company. They would probably leave it to government, which at least theoretically, you have the ability to petition. If we want to provide people with the basic human needs of citizens, allow citizens and communities to enhance and sustain the quality of their lives, and create conditions for all individuals to reach their full potential, I don't think we can rely on the private sector to do that in a way that is equitable for all people, which is not represented. All people are not represented by the folks in this room today or those that are necessarily at the highest levels of companies and investment firms. That's why at USCIF, where I work, we have a very strong focus on policy because it brings our more than $3 trillion in members, $3 trillion in assets in our membership, allows us the opportunity to come together and magnify our impacts in a way that will bring systemic change. Let's start with something probably on all our minds today. I think we all saw the shooting in Florida yesterday. This comes after shootings one after the other in schools and in neighborhoods around the country. Do we think that the private sector is going to change that? Private sector cannot change that. The private sector supplies those guns, and they have a financial incentive to do so. Government has done an absolutely egregious job of changing this. We've gone backwards in the last decade, but it is the only place that can make that change. I personally do not wish to go into a movie theater and look for the exit signs. I personally do not want to worry about my 14-year-old going to school and being shot during the day. Who is going to change that for us? Only the groups that make systemic change, and that is government. Let's just review very quickly in my 37 seconds left. What have been the massive pieces of legislation that has changed our lives? Just a few. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act, the Clean Air Act. We kind of like clean air, don't we? The Clean Water Act, Parental Leave Act, the Wilderness Act, minimum wage, fair housing, consumer product safety, the Americans with Disability Act, and the list goes on. We cannot rely on the private sector to provide each of us and all of those not represented in this room with those incredibly important protections.
Thank you. And so now we have another pro the argument.
Lisa, that's a great litany of fantastic successes that have happened over the last 200 years here in America. But the question is about today. The question is, who will drive social progress today? Companies or this government that continues to do nothing about gun shootings at schools, that continues to do nothing about dirty water in Flint, Michigan, that continues to do nothing about solving the wage gap between the genders. This government continues to do nothing. Who does? Entrepreneurial businesses, entrepreneurial investors, entrepreneurial humans who decide to take risks, who decide to say, no thank you, inertia, we're going to try something different. We're going to experiment, we're going to fail, but we're going to also succeed. We're going to change things. Progress implies change. Do you really have more faith in the government to provide change that's progressive or successful or serves the needs of our citizens? Or do you think private individuals will be the ones driving that change? Our own government, both parties, constantly talk about the power of small business. Small businesses create jobs. They create opportunities. They're the lifeblood of America, as we keep hearing from both parties. Small businesses are the source of progress. Entrepreneurs are the source of progress. Who mapped the human genome? Not the National Institutes of Health, right? Who is solving mass transit innovation? Elon Musk, not Elaine Chao at the Department of Transportation, right? Look, we live in a democracy, and yet more than 70% of Americans believe in some pretty fundamental things, that we should enact legislation to solve this gun problem that we continue to have. More than 70% of Americans believe in gender pay equality. More than 70% of Americans believe we should have universal health care. More than 70% of Americans believe we should have equal access to vote in our elections. More than 70% of Americans believe we shouldn't be fighting wars in far-off places to protect oil supplies. But where is this democracy? This democracy is stuck in this inertia where short-term interests of getting reelected, pandering to the special interests who fund those elections, ironically, wealthy businesses, in many cases, the source of the power. If the source of the power is the money, we've got to change the money and the source of the power before we can even talk about government. At the end of the day, this question boils down very simply, as investors in this room, will you bet, will you invest in someone like Elon Musk to solve major problems and help progress us, or would you bet on Donald Trump?
Okay, back to our against.
That's fantastic.
Ooh, you never give an inch. Don't give an inch.
I think he's being sarcastic.
I absolutely am.
Good man. That's the attitude.
Okay. My name's Kurt Summers. I'm the treasurer of the city of Chicago. There are other forms of government than the federal government and the current presidential administration, I'd like to note.
Thank God.
Lisa provided opening remarks that showed how government leads by example, both in the past and the present. And in my remarks, I want to focus on the levers that government pulls to enact social progress. What you heard were a litany of examples, as our counterparts here said, over the last 200 years, but they were often in response to bad action by the private sector. That's why the SEC was created. That's why we have workers' rights. That's why you have a weekend. You're welcome. It's because of bad action when the private sector takes the lead. The government, as a policymaker, sets standards, regulates private industry, and conducts tax policy to ensure that markets work better for all citizens, not just private companies. Minimum wage is a good example. The federal government has established a basic standard for wages that businesses can build on and offer higher wages and merit compensation for their employees. We see it in regulatory policy with the Clean Air Act and environmental. We've seen it in financial with the CFPB and the SEC, and in tax policy. The tax policies themselves that foster innovation by providing credits for research and development, by providing credits for sustainability, by providing credits for affordable housing, by providing credits for investment in our most needed areas. I'd like to point out the now and what happens today. And I'm so glad that the issues of diversity and pay gap were raised, couple facts that I think you should know. According to the Office of Personnel Management, more than 1/3 of senior executive positions in federal agencies are held by women versus 21% of C-suite positions in the private sector. Regarding pay gap, according to the OPM, federal government pays women in white-collar jobs 89 cents for every dollar that men in white-collar jobs make, significantly less than the national average of about 79 cents in all other jobs. What's even less is the 57 cents that's provided in financial services jobs. It's important for us to talk about these numbers. The government as an investor. One of the premises that was raised is that we have to follow the money or change the money. Government has been the leader with respect to investing in social and responsible investment strategies and ESG strategies. We need only look right here in the city of New York, which just last month announced that they would have full divestment from carbon-producing investors. The largest investors in the world are public institutions. In the United States, 7 of the top 10 investors, institutional investors, are government agencies like CalPERS and CalSTRS and New York Common and New York City. You see it in the divestment of fossil fuels, but you also see it in diversity initiatives. In the case of fund managers that are really the flow of access to capital, only 7% of fund managers, of the top 200 fund managers, corporate fund managers, have policies to invest with minority and women-owned businesses versus 33% amongst the government actors.
I'm going to have to cut you off there.
Yeah.
You're out of time. You can use your other points for your 3 minutes rebuttal. Your rebuttal. We've heard some great points. You've run out of time. Come on, 3 minutes.
Let's do that.
Told you I'd be strict.
We're going to share the rebuttal.
Okay.
So I think that the points, I won't call them litanies. I'd like to say that the very good points of our opponents are true. I think that the idea, I want to come back to this notion of the today. And the statistics that were cited, I think, are also very fairly represented. But I think that when you look at engagement and stewardship in the investment world, what has really shifted now, and what we think is going to be a catalyst and something that is going to be moving very quickly, is the fact that the private sector and the investment community itself has realized some of the errors of the past and is not looking to be slapped around with further fines, especially the thing with the asset management community. They've looked at seeing what happened with regulators with the banks, and they do not want to have the same situation happen to them. So arguably, this is the time when we can start to see momentum and a shift in terms of the engagement discussions that are happening with companies about gender pay. Absolutely right that has been an issue. And that equally, the investment companies that we start to see are now publishing goals that they have about gender pay of their own fund managers and their own portfolio managers, and diversity goals that they have about equaling out what has been rather disappointing numbers in terms of female representation running money. And we heard today about the importance of actually shifting the idea of portfolio manager mindsets. So what we would say is that regulation is not going to be something that is going to encourage more innovation in that area. What we would say is that there's a realization that the transformation in mindset is what's happening right now, that doing nothing is not an answer. And that what we really see start to happen is that the investment community itself and corporations, and I gave the ideas before, could be from resiliency, could be from self-preservation, could be from performance and innovation. All these factors mean that as of today, what has been the cited statistics is not what it is tomorrow. And I think that in spite of the idea that we sometimes are skeptical about the self-regulation quality of private enterprise, I would say we're really facing a moment of no return. They have no choice. I would say that what we see is that no one wants to be faced with the nonprofit community and other activists coming to the doors of companies. No one wants to be in that position anymore. Further, the actual information available to follow what peers are doing and what information is out there is that you don't have much of this ability to be opaque anymore.
You're not leaving your colleague anytime.
Thank you very much. Sorry about that. What you for? Do you want to throw something out? So, I got on a roll. I got into my Hyde Park corner. So I think that what we would like to say is that don't judge by the past performance of some of these wonderful statistics of government by what is coming out of the private sector today.
Sorry. You could have had another 30 seconds.
Can I have his 16?
Nope.
Oh.
How are you doing it all?
Yes.
Okay, 3 minutes.
So let's take the word now and think of that as a construct of decades. I think Donald Trump is a bar too low for us to use to judge the history of the government past and the government future. I hope it's a bar too low. You know, it was interesting when I took a speak at a conference 24 hours after the election, 2016. And my co-panelists talked a lot about how the private sector was going to have to step up to the plate, given the new administration we had at the federal level, at least. I mean, there's certainly states like California that are honestly becoming the arbiters of great government policy, and that's happening around the country, but I'm going to focus on the federal government. And I said, you know, we can't expect that the government, the private sector, is going to step up to the plate entirely. One, it's generally not been seen as a role. Two, there are very few CEOs who see themselves as really part of the civic conversation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But three, there's going to be a deeply deregulatory environment coming forward, and there will be companies that run fast as can be towards that, and that has turned out to be true. Let's just talk about Paul Pullman. You ask somebody, who's a great CEO? One, pretty much everyone says Paul Pullman. He is the #1 internationally respected CEO. He said things like, I represent one of the biggest NGOs when he took over Unilever. He said, Unilever's been around for 100+ years. We want to be around for several hundred more. So if you buy into the long-term value creation model, which is equitable, which is shared, which is sustainable, then come and invest with us. If you don't buy into this, I respect you as a human being, but don't put your money in our company. Why is Paul Pullman the only one saying this? Where are those other company leaders who are going to step into the breach? I don't see very many Paul Pullmans. If we had 3,000 Paul Pullmans, I might buy your argument. But with one, maybe 2, 3, 4 we can come up with internationally, I can't buy into it. What have we seen as real truth in the last several months? One of the first things this administration did was say, we're going to roll back the mileage standards. 3, 4 car companies came to the White House to applaud, to be part of a photo op. Those car companies sponsor our conference. They sponsor the Series conference. But when that deregulatory model came, my God, they made their way to the White House, didn't they? They made their way to the White House when the tax bill hit the floor. They made their way to the White House when the Dodd-Frank bill was going to be turned back in the House Financial Services Act. All the great work we've all done on shareholder engagement. We had companies say, we don't want those shareholder proposals coming to us. Yes, let's gut the shareholder process. We're still fighting that. So companies can be a wonderful force for good. They can fill the breach, but if we think that they're ever going to fill the role of government to move our society forward, I don't think so. And now shows that that's really not the case as well.
I'm not going to let you clap until the end, but those were all fantastic. So I marked a couple of points where I want to pick you up on things. So one thing I wanted to say to our pro side, to our pro the motion, it's been my experience living in different countries, in particular in Brazil, that private sectors accommodate the government they have. And that is just they're trying to do business. So, if your government is offering you deregulation, you take deregulation. If your government is turning a blind eye to things, private sector tends to go along with that. So how can private sector be better than government when the experience globally is that private sector accommodates to government?
Well, the government sets the rules, right? It's important to remember that what private sector always asks for is transparent, long-term, certain policies so that they know what the rules of the game are and they can play. So that's absolutely consistent with what you're saying. But we need to do a little bit of a math exercise because it's really important to realize that we only have one government. We have thousands and thousands of companies. And when it comes to revolutionary change, it takes one person, Martin Luther King, right? It takes one entrepreneur. The changes that we have seen that are radical changes are very singular examples. Henry Ford, creating arguably the middle class of America with manufacturing, right? Mary Barra, who's now the CEO of GM, who you just took to the laundry, she promises zero congestion, zero pollution, and zero crashes to her shareholders. Where's the government doing any of that, right?
Because I want to take lots and lots of questions. So then my question for you guys is the examples that you gave of wonderful things that governments do, they do them because of pressure. Governments don't come out of nowhere. And often that pressure has come from companies or come from people. So you're attributing to the government things that came from elsewhere.
Is this the rebuttal part, or are we
This
on
is an
the open
answer
question
to the
part?
question.
I'm picking at your arguments. Yeah?
Oh, okay,
So-
fine.
I'll take that.
I just wasn't sure where we were.
Oh, we're now at the we're all picking at you. Okay,
Right.
so
So
I'm starting.
We live in a democratic society where elected representatives respond to their voters and to the people and not to the companies. What I would say, though, if you think about the pro side, what was admitted is that government is not going to sit around. Corporations aren't going to sit around anymore because they don't want to get fined. They don't want a reaction from regulation. We've seen that before, and yeah, the numbers are bad now, and yeah, they haven't shown their commitment to diversity or gender equality, but they will because they're afraid of the actions, the leadership that government will take. If there's anyone that sort of expressed reaction in this debate, it's been the pro.
So that
And
really
can I also
yeah,
answer?
sure.
So there is a definite distinction between companies and people. I think the
Not
Supreme
according to
Court,
the Supreme Court
notwithstanding, on Citizens United. So it generally, if you look at the litany of legislation that I read out a little bit earlier, most of it was done in the last 40 years, not in the last 200, but those are generally are the result of social movements and of legislators who responded to those social movements or were born of those social movements, which is what you're probably going to see in 2018 when we have elections. And so there may have been companies supportive of that. I think if we ever get a climate bill of some kind, you will see companies step up to the plate because they understand the need for that. But companies generally have not led social change. It's never happened. It never will happen. So and so the idea that it's the government reacting to pressure, that's true. But it's pressure generally coming from their constituents as individuals.
So just before I open it up to the floor, a couple of points jumped out at me as points where you guys kind of conceded something to the opposite side without intending to. So I thought one of those was where you said government has done an egregious job on dealing with guns.
Correct.
And if anything is going to happen here, it is not going to come from government. I think that is really very clear at this point, I'm sorry to say.
It has to come from government. There's no other place.
But it's not going to. So I think, not now. There's a now in our proposition.
Chicago tried to do something about
yeah, but
it.
you're being stopped. You're being
Yes.
blocked. I mean,
Yes.
there's bits of government try to do things. So So if anything is going to happen
But
there,
it's not going to come from the private sector, and that's the other point, that it will never come from the private sector.
I mean, I think that's
What is
arguable.
our best hope for social progress today?
On guns,
Best hope.
On guns, I think there's a zero on one place and there's a slightly more than zero elsewhere. So I thought that was very much conceding a point to the opposite side. And then I thought one where you guys really conceded without intending to. You said that the private sector didn't need to be regulated to act on things like, they don't need to, I wrote down, they don't want to be slapped with fines. That's government action. It's government. And it was like, we don't need government to act better. We're going to act better without needing regulation. I forget which of the two of you it was. He's nodding, it was him. But actually, it's government that has set those expectations. So, you were saying that was something that we could put on the private sector side. I think that's something we put on the government side. Right.
Sonia Gibbs with the IIF. Question for the pro side here. Okay. Now, what about the role of government regulation in a benign sense, in terms of not just kind of slapping fines or saying mandatory disclosure is necessary, but in growing the market? Okay, there's a failing in the private sector. You need maybe incentives, like lower capital ratios or to get the market to grow.
None of us are saying that there's no role for the government. The question is who gives us the best hope for progress on a number of social dimensions. And so, as I said, the government needs to set the rules of the game. As our moderator astutely pointed out, we have rules of the game we have to play in.
Flattery
right?
gets you nowhere in this.
Exactly.
It's them that's voting.
Right.
There are absolutely market failures where we are accustomed to socializing responsibility, right? There's no way to defend the United States without some sort of a defense budget. That is not something that a private enterprise is going to likely provide.
I love it when you can get them to argue on the other side. Thank you.
And just one last
But that's
thing.
not progress.
It's not, yeah, but the consistency in those types of incentives is something that private enterprise welcomes and applauds.
Just a question for the pro side. If private industry has the ability to create social change, then why don't they just do it? And is there an example where private industry has actually taken a lead on a social issue and moved forward with it without pressure from
Fantastic.
government?
Great.
I think Rise of the Rest, Village Capital, you heard just a few minutes ago, examples of where the private industry has stepped in to solve a market failure, which is that we don't have enough entrepreneurship and innovation in the middle of the country. That concentration of job creation has been in 5 cities. By the way, the concentration of job creation is entirely in the private sector. And if you think jobs are important to social progress, you might therefore think that the private sector has a pretty key role to play. I think what we also are forgetting is that all of the people marching, I among them, in the streets are almost entirely employed by the private sector. And as we continue to show what the private sector can do, people will continue to step up and demand, just like constituents of government, they will demand of their companies, the companies for whom they work and the companies in whom they invest, that they demonstrate their values.
And on this
So
one,
were,
if I just
were you
add one,
marching with your company with
Yes,
sign with
we
a sign for your company? So most private sector companies were out there marching together.
Were you marching with a government? I mean,
No,
I
but
don't
what
understand.
you're saying is you're saying that you work for private companies. So I'm assuming there's an assumption one should make from that
Yeah,
means
what
that
is
the
argument
private
you're
sector
making
is sort of marching with you.
All of those people who are demanding social progress and driving it work in the private sector.
Yeah.
And you are influencing
perhaps, you know,
leadership.
perhaps your company
I just
doesn't
think
want you.
in the former debate, when there are factual inaccuracies, we should just point them out. In the city of Chicago, the 3 top employers are the state of Illinois, the federal government, and the city of Chicago.
How many jobs have been created in the last
We
20
have
years?
we have a hand here. This is great. Keep going, but I just want to get the mic to him. You were about to say
I
something
did
too.
want to say something.
Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yeah, yeah.
I think just in terms of your question, the other thing that you see happening on the private sector on that question, again, it's evolutionary. We heard about the evolution-revolution idea today, is that the retention of employees is being driven by the need to meet these social requirements. And so whether it be on the streets as citizens or as consumers and how we demand product and services and delivery, or what we want in staying with our employers. This is a change that we see happening, and statistics are showing, I've seen it in my own company, about the retention of employees based on the idea of social progress being made with key milestones and impact.
So that's the answer to that channel or that action. Chris, yep.
Well, so with hope that both the government and private sector lead, just back from the Climate Change Summit in Tempe, Arizona, we heard the mayor of Tempe, the mayor of Pittsburgh talk about Renaissance in their communities, and the government's leading that. So I just want to salute Mr. Summers for pointing out that when we think of government, we shouldn't just think of federal government and the Trump administration.
How many people did just think of the federal government when they voted at the beginning? I kind of did too. Yeah,
So,
okay.
good point, Mr. Summers. Thank you very much.
Right, any more questions? Who else wants the mic?
My question could be for either side, but let's start with the pro and then go with the con. You each individually, in your roles, what are you doing to make sure that the gender gap pay is equal? And what are each of you as individuals doing to make sure that minorities are getting an equal shot at careers, job advancement, all of the above?
Fantastic. So I'll take the other question first. Yep.
Oh, this is for the cons, especially both on a local and on a federal level. Sorry, I'll stand. Both on a federal and on a local level. As the country has become more diverse, we've seen a manipulation of the voter process and the public involvement process, specifically through gerrymandering as one example. So an important part of our debate today is about today, what happens today. So in what ways do you see the government operating for social change in that kind of environment?
So fantastic. So you guys, you claim the public sector or the private sector is doing all this stuff. What are you doing? And, government. Yeah, go.
Can we start with the first question?
Yeah, you guys are doing the first
Just
question.
checking.
Yeah.
Okay, so on your question, thank you very much for the question, because it's a topic that's near and dear to me, so you happen to hit a sweet spot in this case. What we've put in as a company, so I'll start with the company first, is that there's blind CVs. We heard a bit about that today, blind CVs, so the names are taken off. That's about gender and minorities. Shortlist candidates, there has to be a pipeline of bringing in candidates that are not just in the traditional types of backgrounds. And so that's a whole thing about that. We've retrained human resource requirements as well as the headhunting agencies that we use. In terms of targets internally, there's about roles and making sure you're not left with just the HR person that's a woman, kind of a classic pitfall one often sees. And so it's about how to actually create a pipeline that's going to bring a more equal board. The management board at the company I represent now is 40% women, as an example of that. There are mentoring programs that have been created also in terms of bringing women with both senior levels of management, that might be men in this case, I think sometimes that happens, and ensuring that there's, again, a valve that's being released to discuss issues that, back to the point you made earlier about being uncomfortable, that has been embraced, the idea of being uncomfortable around this.
You didn't put your hand up, though,
I was in the room.
Oh, okay.
I was watching you from the TV.
Right, did you put your hand up outside?
Yep.
Okay, good. Because just in the interest of getting lots of questions, the question for you was about, for the government question. What's government doing in this?
Yeah, first, I can just say what we're doing in the city of Chicago and in my office. 52% of my employees are female, 48% are male, 2/3 are ethnic minorities, and that's across both junior and senior levels. Importantly, though, to the point of putting your money where your mouth is, I manage an $8 billion portfolio, and 60% of the trading that I do is with minority and women-owned firms. Vastly different from the statistics that I shared about what private fund managers do in that regard. And finally, what we've just recently launched in the last 2 years is an innovative $300 million local investment fund, again, taking our capital and investing it locally, specifically, and this may tie to the gerrymandering question, but specifically to the communities that are most in need, that have suffered from disinvestment from both sectors, from everyone, for decades.
And you guys are going to have to stand up and say, what's government going to do to stop gerrymandering and voter deregistration and so on, because, you've got to defend the government here. These are major sources of, deprogress, retrogression, whatever the word is.
Yeah, okay, I'll take that one too.
Good.
She looked at me like, hey, government guy.
And then I'll let you.
Look, I think the answer to that is all about transparency and accountability. And in every state house in this country, it's not just what happens after the 2018 elections and the 2020 census, but it's about a transparent process. In Illinois, we're required by law. This is actually something I'm proud of. This is a lawsuit that my grandfather had to fight for 35 years ago to provide for independent mapping and multiple sources of maps to be created and for them to be put on public display and for public comment. That doesn't exist in most states around the country, but it won't without more transparency and accountability.
I'm going to allow you the chance to ask each other questions. I know, Lisa, you wanted to.
So I have a simple question, because some of these pieces of legislation that have radically changed people's lives, women's rights, voting rights, these are massive issues, very hard to get done, took decades. But sick leave, that seems pretty easy, right?
And so sick leave seems like a basic benefit everybody should get, that the private sector, the government provides that. Private sector hasn't stepped up to the plate. So you've seen cities like Washington, D.C., Bill de Blasio in New York, mandate sick leave. That seems like a bottom of the barrel issue, right? That is, you want to talk about providing basic structure for society. It seems like sick leave is a pretty basic one. So if we can't get that done in the private sector without the government mandating it, what can we really rely on the private sector to step up to the plate on?
Great question.
I don't know anything about sick leave, so I can't really talk about it. But I will say,
You have some though, right?
we do. In fact, we have an unlimited vacation policy for our employees to go pursue whatever interests they want to do outside of work, including take care of loved ones when they're sick or take care of themselves when they are sick. I have the benefit of being a private company, so to answer the question, I'm obviously a white male, an old white male in waiting, as I said earlier today. My CFO is an old white woman in waiting, so you know we are actually very balanced on the gender front within our 28-person company. We have the flexibility to do that because we are a privately held company.
Why can the private sector not mobilize to actually make that change
But
happen
the
across
point
the
is
board?
that the question is whether it's across the board that is the actual question. That is not the question. The question is who will drive social progress best.
But who gets that?
But,
Who
but,
gets
but,
that
but
sick
by the way,
leave?
just by the way,
Google is driving
so-
social progress.
Yeah, but that's not
better.
helping, you know, the minimum wage person.
So at system
Social
level, though,
progress or innovation?
At system,
Right. That's-
no, but at
those are two
system level, let
different
me respond. Let me respond to this question in my 35 seconds. The idea of sick leave, the case that you gave, or gender parity, these types of social issues. What I can tell you is that, and this goes back to how transparent can investors be, and this is always a challenge about how much investors can speak openly about what's going on. What I'll tell you about your specific question is that investors are actually uniting and discussing this in a collaborative engagement fashion with a number of companies. And so we as a company, we have actually looked at a list of key gender items that we bring up in our engagements with the companies that we have ownership stakes in. And we've talked with fellow investors, including asset owners and pension funds, about doing that together in an aligned fashion to bring more weight and bulk.
Good place to stop. Right, I'm going to give you your 2 minutes first to wrap up and, you know, last chance to move the needle.
Okay. I'm going
No
to start
pressure.
by a quote from a U.S. treasurer named Maya Angelou. When people show you who they are, believe them. If they haven't shown you that they will change, there's no reason for you to believe that they will. To summarize our argument, government has been and always will be a leader, a policymaker, and importantly, an investor, the largest source of institutional investment capital in this country. Whether we look at the past or the present, government has always pushed the envelope on social progress, raising the quality of life for all of us by fighting for civil rights, retirement security, workers' rights, health care for all, and gender equality. As a policymaker, whether we look at labor standards or regulatory policy on carbon emissions or financial regulation, government has the tools to advance social progress. And many of those tools only reside in the hands of government. And we can compel the private sector through both carrot and stick with incentives, with capital investment, which is what's happening with Elon Musk in Chicago, and to compel them to do what is in society's best interest rather than its own. And finally, government as an investor, again, whether we look at CalPERS, CalSTRS, New York City, or Chicago, government is at the tip of the spear when it comes to aligned social and financial returns. Because of all this and more, we urge you to vote against this resolution because it's clearly government and not private investors or companies that are the best hope for social progress in America today.
Do you want to use up your 20 seconds or?
Well, let me just do a couple quick facts, and that's 20 seconds. In October 2017, Bloomberg became the first U.S. corporation and only to sign the UNPRI, one of the hosts of this event. Why is that? The only 8% of corporate defined contribution plans even have socially responsible investment fund options in their plans, only 8%.
I've accidentally given them a few seconds extra, so I will give you a few seconds extra, okay, as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look, I have a lot of hope about progress because of the next generation that is ascending to roles that have authority in our system, whether it's in government or the private sector. But if you ask a great young person today what job they want to have, what role they want to have, many of them have intentionality, that's been talked about today, for impact, right? Do you think that they admire Lynn Jurek, the CEO of the largest solar company in the United States? Or do you think they want to be in city, state, or federal government? Where do you think they are choosing to go? They're choosing to go to the private sector. I think that that is a pretty indicative signal. And even talking about civil rights, do we really have hope that someone like Clarence Thomas is going to be the source of civil rights on the Supreme Court? Or is it going to be Tim Cook, the leader of the largest company in the United States, who stood up to the North Carolina government and said, we're not going to do business in your state if you do what you're doing with the bathroom laws? That's civil rights progress driven by the private sector, but most importantly, folks, it's driven by individuals, whether they're in government or the private sector. And the leadership that we need to go against the inertia of the system that requires our social progress in the first place, that leadership is unfortunately not in the government today. And that is the question before you.
So can we have a show of hands for, I'll read the motion one more time before you vote. This House believes that investors and companies, not governments, are the best hope for social progress in America today. So can I have a show of hands for yes, agreeing with that? And Con? You really moved the needle, Con. Great stuff. Fantastic, all of you.
Good luck.